Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming along. I'm here to talk to you about kind of video games communities, the personal, business and moral case for playing nice, and particularly about tackling toxicity within video games communities. We're going to probably spend more time on the stuff that's within the brackets and talking about the issues around that, but I wanted to try and frame it around kindness, like a kindness sandwich, some would describe it as, and by some I mean me. So in terms of just that summary, we're going to set a bit of the scene around game community today and some of those challenges. I'm going to demonstrate that personal, business and moral argument for us tackling toxicity. And I'm going to provide some tips on building kinder communities in general. So who on earth am I? So I'm George. I'm the founder of Half Space Consulting, which is a strategic communications consultancy that specialises in the video game sector, particularly at the points where video games intersect with wider society. I'm the creator of Video Games Industry Memo, which is a weekly Substack newsletter. It looks into the policy, business and culture of games. We've got about 3,500 subscribers now, so we're building a lovely little community. And I'm author of a forthcoming book called Power Play, the inside story of how video games influence the world. That's due out in spring 2026. And lovely news, I've got a UK and Commonwealth publishing deal, which means that it will be available in Australia and New Zealand, which is fantastic. Interesting point, the book's rights are still sold on the basis of the Commonwealth, but we won't go there today, we'll leave that. A little bit as well about my sort of experience and who I've worked with. So I came into this company that I created myself off the back of having previously worked as the head of campaigns and communications at UKI, which is the UK equivalent of IGEA. And so what I had to do was deal with a lot of reputational challenges around the video game sector, and I had to go forwards and basically argue to and sometimes with policymakers and press about the nature of the video game sector, what was really going on there. And so as an example of that, I was responsible for leading the country's responsible play campaign. So we were trying to encourage parents to have more conversations, use parental controls to help manage video games play, to go and deal with concerns that parents had around things like video game addiction, people spending too much money on games, those kinds of things. And so what happened here was we worked with a leading sports personality, a guy called Rio Ferdinand, who was a former England footballer, to act as the face of the campaign. That happened at the beginning of 2020. And then this bullet point below, there was a government call for evidence around loot boxes in video games. And they ended up recommending the campaign that we had kicked off and the successor campaign that I launched as a good example of industry self-regulation, an example of helping to address issues as they happened. So I've taken that work in to what I do with my clients. My clients are quite varied. I do work with games businesses, so one of my big clients is CCP, who are the makers of EVE Online. But then the clients kind of more towards that right-hand side, you see people like the UN's Environment Programme via their Playing for the Planet Alliance, which is their community of video games developers who are trying to tackle climate change by encouraging their player base to get involved and take positive actions to support the climate. You also have people like OCA, who are an organisation who in the UK fund cultural content that seeks to challenge misperceptions within society, and they're funded by a major philanthropic organisation called the Wellcome Trust. And you also have the Games Rating Authority, who manage the PEGI age rating process in the UK, so equivalent of what the Australian Classification Board does. And then just to give you a sort of a sense of why I sort of founded this business and what I think has been going on within the game sector generally, this is a kind of a representation of the audience of the people who read Video Games Industry Memo, my newsletter. And I think what you can see is, yeah, we have the video games industry and you have the established sector that we all really know of. But I think this is especially the case in the UK, but I'm interested elsewhere about what's going on. You're starting to see many more businesses and cultural organisations within wider society getting interested in video games, everything from banks to big consulting firms to cultural organisations like BAFTA. You have the media in the bottom left. Yes, you've got video games media, but you also have the New York Times, the FT, people like that who are taking a real interest in games. And then finally, Policy Corner in the bottom right. So, my newsletter is read by policymakers in the US, the EU, Australia, UK, who are all now starting to look at video games and say, what's going on within this world? Because it's too significant to not pay attention to. So that's that kind of perspective that I've got, and it's that perspective that shapes a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about here. And so what I'm going to do is, again, as mentioned, go through that three-step process of setting the scene, talking about the personal, the business, and the moral case for tackling toxicity, and talking about the foundations of kinder communities. But just before we go into the setting the scene thing, I am going to just issue just a quick trigger warning here. We are going to go into some darker places. There is going to be language in this talk that is sexist. There's going to be language that is racist, misogynistic. There will also be an image of a mass shooting. So I'm just letting people know. And yes, unfortunately, this is related to video games community. So if that's something that's of discomfort, I will let you know prior to each slide, just in case. But so I promise it's not all heavy. There's lots of lighter stuff in here too, but I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware. So let's get on with scene setting. Now, as we all well know, billions of people around the world play video games. So this is from Newzoo's latest market data, which showed that 3.4 billion people play video games. We can also probably reasonably guess that in 2025, 3.5 billion will play, and in 2026, 3.6 billion will play. But they've locked it out of the graph to make sure that you pay to download the report. Gotta love that upselling. But the key thing about it is to say, with such an enormous audience, what we've seen is obviously the proliferation of video games communities across the world that are capable of doing brilliant, amazing, unique, interesting, engaging things. So it can just be around the general community within video games and the people who love the medium and what they can do around it. My favourite example that's been doing the rounds quite a lot recently, it's all of the games done quick thing, and specifically the dog that plays video games. So this is the fundraising Shiba Inu who plays Ken Griffey Jr.'s baseball by basically popping its paw out to get a treat. But you look at this and you go, it's absurd, it's silly, it's a dog playing video games to a live audience. But you look in that bottom right corner and you see $882,000 raised for Doctors Without Borders. You know, video games communities, when they're kind, when they're engaged, they're interested, they can raise loads and loads of money for great causes. They can do good within society. They can also just be fun and silly and stupid. So, you know, the Helldivers 2 breakout success this year. Why was Helldivers 2 such a huge success? It's a great video game, obviously. It's an entertaining video game. But there is something about, literally at one point, millions of people around the world role-playing as essentially Starship Troopers, going out, spreading democracy across the universe. It's that sense of everyone buying in on the same joke, committing to it, and then the game developer themselves acting as the kind of crazy dungeon master over the top of it. These are the kinds of experiences that video games offer that no other creative medium can. And we're so lucky that we get to experience these things. And so you would obviously think, right, no-brainer. Surely it's a good idea for video games communities to be kind, to be nice places to be. And if you're looking at arguments within academia and you're looking at arguments within the scientific community, that's the obvious answer. So I picked out this book because it came out earlier this year. But as a general point around the research base, if you go and look it up, most academics who are looking into the science of kindness agree the places that are kinder and people who are kinder are, generally speaking, in better health, less stressed, and in the case of this book, they demonstrate that you're more likely to have better cardiovascular health if you're kinder to people. So, you know, it seems like kind of an obvious thing to do from a personal reason, and it also seems like an obvious thing to do from just our experience of life. If you think about when you've ever walked into, say, a bar, imagine that there's two people slugging it out over a nearby pool table and there's a window smashed. You're going, probably not going to hang out in there, am I? So, funnily enough, you go and gravitate towards spaces that feel more kind and more welcoming. Yet, there's a problem with this, and that is that the reality is that when we come down to talking about what's going on within video games communities, it is actually surprisingly difficult at times to make the business argument for creating kinder communities as standard. And so the reason why I think it's harder to do so is I think it's a general challenge around the game sector. The games industry is obviously an economically challenging sector. It is very, very easy for a game to fail. It is very, very easy for your game to not sell as well as it should. It is very easy for us to land in a position where, as we've seen across a lot this year, the economic situation changes, jobs are lost. So there's a tendency to see things like PR, marketing, community management solely about the end goal. What does it mean in terms of sales? And if it doesn't impact sales, it's not worth having. Now, that's not actually the way that a lot of community management should be working, because it should be actually around that sense of how do you bolster the reputation around this space? How do you make it somewhere that people want to go? How do you make it somewhere that people want to live in? But when people are really starting to look at the bottom line, what happens is that the people who end up sitting there on the front line and being responsible for trying to generate kinder, more inclusive, welcoming community spaces are often the first on the chopping block. So you have here Lady Devan, who is one of the senior community managers at Activision Blizzard, who is one of the high-profile community management casualties from their most recent round of layoffs. And outside of video games more generally, you've seen that big tech companies, essentially, they've been cutting their trust and safety teams in response to the economic conditions going on, because people go, well, what's the return on investment of trust and safety? What's the benefit of us having this, especially if there's no one beating the door down? And I think the answer on that is something that we're going to come to, and you wait until I make this argument for you. But I think one of the key things around it is that actually you can see what happens within certain games and certain companies when you don't have these things in place, and the kind of awkwardness that this can lead to. So the example I'm picking on actually is Ubisoft in regards to Assassin's Creed Shadows. Now, over the summer, there was some controversy around the fact that the game decided to have one of its lead characters, Yasuke, be a black samurai. Now, in terms of what the controversy online said that it was not a historically accurate representation of what happened with Yasuke, the character they based him upon from Japanese history, because the person who he was based upon was a Portuguese Mozambique man who was part of an emperor's retinue in the late 16th century in Japan, but there's no evidence that he actually became a samurai. There was no evidence that it was specifically that he was the first person to become, say, a black samurai. Now, I think a lot of this was contrived for many reasons. I think the first thing was that everyone is well aware that Assassin's Creed as a series is one that takes liberties with history because it is a form of historical fiction. We all accept that that's possible. But the reason why I particularly think it's contrived is because this is a series that, remember, was so historically accurate that it allowed you to drive a Leonardo da Vinci designed tank in Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. And so realistically, what was the motivation of those people online to throw mud against this game? I would probably argue here publicly that it was a racist motivation. It was deliberately picking on a character who was black as a deliberate point of trying to essentially create controversy and try and essentially signal to people within their community that they were these people who were pushing forwards this narrative, that they were essentially all part of one big advanced community. And so when we look towards that kind of case study of it, we look then about how Ubisoft responded to it. And what we got was a statement that was poor, to be honest. If you go and read the statement in full, which I do recommend that you do, it was a non-apology. It says here, like, for this we sincerely apologise in terms of what was going on with the representation, apparently, of the Japanese community in regards to a black samurai. But again, Ubisoft was also saying things like, yeah, but all of this footage is being presented to go along. We can change this. We can sort this out afterwards. Going off to the community of people who had essentially fomented this crisis online and saying, yeah, no, we can fix this all in post. But then also at the bottom saying, yeah, can you also make sure that you respectfully criticise our teams? Can you go and look after this? What Ubisoft managed to do was essentially create in this space by not essentially pushing back against these people and saying, this is very clearly contrived. We are doing exactly the same thing that we are doing with any other Assassin's Creed game. Stop abusing our developers. They instead gave those people some credence and said, we're going to start maybe making some changes off the basis of what your feedback is. And then also at the same time, I think failed to defend their staff effectively. So you created this space where toxicity was winning out. And, the game's been delayed, but quite frankly, one of the things that was really interesting about underneath it was pre-orders for it in the last financial quarter were above expectations. So publicly, fans were really excited for it, that Ubisoft was catering to the more toxic side of things. So the question is, how do we push back against this, and how do we argue in favour of kindness? Well, I'm going to do that now by looking to provide some data and case studies to show, first of all, the personal impact of toxicity, what impact it has on people. Then I'm going to be looking at that business case, making the argument around facts and figures that demonstrate the clear cash return for tackling it. And then finally, looking at some moral quandaries that we need to face. So, the personal pain of toxicity. Let's start with the Anti-Defamation League in America. So, they release a report every year called Hate is No Game, Hate and Harassment in Online Games. Latest version of it came out this summer, and what it found was that 76% of adult gamers and 75% of young gamers have experienced harassment within video games. Now, that is obviously quite a bad set of figures. And I think when you start breaking it down, it gets worse in lots of different ways, because you can see, especially amongst young players, the way that harassment manifests itself is pretty widespread. So it includes, when you look at that kind of figure for any harassment, it includes things like specific disruptions of play, so things like trolling and griefing. It includes slurs. It includes being embarrassed and excluded. It's quite a wide range of issues. And I think what's even more important about this for us as people who work within this sector, and for people who are considering what's going on within our industry, they did a comparable report in June 2023 examining social media. And what they found was that 52% of adults and 51% of young people in America had been harassed on social media. So that means that we are basically a clear quarter above. So it means, another sort of 25 percentage points on top of what you expect in social media. So games have a problem with harassment, and it's a really clear one. And unfortunately, you have even more of a problem in regards to harassment when it's identity-based. So, there are some very minor signs of minor improvement over time in regards to this, but it's pretty clear that, frankly speaking, that if you are from a group that can suffer from identity-based harassment, you are going to suffer this on top of your wider issues. So the same research reported that, yes, 48% of women have, in the past year, been harassed on the basis of their gender identity. We have the fact that if you look across at different profiles in terms of African American, Latinx, Asian American, 50%, 29%, 36% of people have received that kind of identity-based harassment. And it also happens on a religious basis too. The figure in terms of abuse for Muslims up to 36%. One of the things I think that's really worth noting around this, though, is that was already a bad number, but the field work for this particular piece of work was done prior to the attack on the 7th of October. So we just need to keep that in mind, because those figures could actually be worse on the religious side of it. But I said I wanted to talk to you about what this means for people. These are obviously the sort of the numbers that underpin what happens to people. So I just wanted to pull out a few examples, really, of what this means for people. So Michaela Carroll, she's actually a journalist for Sky News in the UK. There was a recent bit of research around the impact of essentially misogyny on women when they're playing games online. She went into a Discord server with an anonymous profile picture, which she then changed to a generic picture of a woman, just to be able to be like, yes, I'm a woman who is in this server. And as she said, the moment that happened, she was called a dirty fucking bitch, or someone else asked to see that pussy. Another player got involved calling me a slag. So straight into that community, the moment she signifies that she's a woman, she's immediately subjected to sexual harassment. You've then got Abu Salim, who is the developer of Tales of Kinsera Zao, which came out earlier this year. When he released the game, he was subjected immediately to racist online abuse in regards to its release. And bearing in mind that this is a game that he has decided to make both in conjunction with his studio, in conjunction with wanting to make something that reflects his African heritage, and something that's about the relationship with his father, to immediately receive waves of racist abuse for creating a video game. As he said, we're being faced with constant target harassment from people who see diversity as a threat. And then finally, Michael de Nooijer. So Michael did not actually suffer this himself. He was the person researching it. So he's at the London School of Economics. And in April 2024, he was researching what was happening in regards to Shia women. So women from a Shia Muslim background, about what happened with them in online games communities. And essentially he said that when they've been discovered online, they've led to all kinds of misogynistic abuse, such as being called a cunt, a slag, and a Shia sket. So this is pretty grim, depressing stuff. And unsurprisingly, it drives people away. So going back to that ADL research, it's a quantitative research survey, but they have a qualitative element, so going and interviewing people. And I found this testimony towards the end, which I think will lead into the toxicity being bad for business stuff. But I think it's just when you read this, I got to a point where I just stopped playing those games online anymore, because, it doesn't matter how strong of a person you are, doesn't matter how confident you are, doesn't matter how brave. You get to a point where you just stop enjoying things that you used to enjoy just to try to protect yourself. I mean, it's a damning quote, really, and it's the kind of thing that makes us all pause, makes us all think, why are we allowing this? It's just not good enough. And I think part of the reason why we allow it is because frankly, there's not really enough of an effort to push back against it, because again, businesses are kind of going, well, hang on, all of this is happening in the background, but what real impact is this happening on us? What cost is it going to have? And the answer is quite a lot. So why toxicity is bad for business? So there's three reasons why it is. So there's what I'm calling the direct cost, the indirect cost, and the induced cost of toxicity. So the direct cost, people spend less money in a toxic game. Simple enough. Indirect cost, they spend less time in toxic games and toxic communities. So ultimately your whole ecosystem suffer. And then you have your induced cost, which is if you get a bad reputation, you're now coming up against online safety regulators who have the ability to act against your business in ways that are going to hurt you very badly financially. So the direct cost of toxicity, how is this measured? Well, there's an organisation in the US, an advocacy group called Take This. In August 2023, they did a survey with Nielsen where they polled 2,328, I put here teens, but actually it's about 15 to 24-year-olds. And what it found, the report, which is titled brilliantly, Toxic Gamers Are Alienating Your Core Demographic, is that yes, players spend 54% less in games that they consider to have a toxic community. And those players were presented with a definition that included things like racist, sexist, homophobic behaviour. So very clearly people are saying they are spending less money in those games. They're also deciding not to spend in those games. So 61% of players have decided against spending on at least one occasion due to abuse, and 24% choose not to spend due to abuse regularly. And I think one of the really key points here is that it really does affect all players, and it really cuts into everyone. So even though men in general are less likely to suffer from some of the identity-based abuse that we were discussing earlier, because obviously men are not women, and men are not necessarily talking about themselves as well, but in terms of LGBTQ+ necessarily. But 46.8% of men who are abused in a game spend less, and they are more likely than women to spend less in a game as a result of being abused. So you have this clear sense that people who are being toxic in your community, they are costing you money. And if that's not a reason immediately to act, well, we can then look towards that indirect impact. So this graph, so it contains that point on the left side, 46.8% of men have decided against spending money based on how others treated them, with 35.6% of women. But what you can also see are the fact that yes, a very strong chunk of people are likely to quit a match or game because of hate or harassment, or they're likely to avoid games because of the reputation of the games community. And when you look into some of the deeper stats in the report, this is borne out just generally across the whole data set, which is, 6 out of 10 people have left a video game match due to harassment, 7 out of 10 have avoided a specific game due to community reputation. And I think one thing that's really key in all of this is that younger players, especially if we're talking about people who are coming through in terms of the next generation, they are much, much more likely, I think it's twice as likely, to essentially make a decision to leave or to not go somewhere on the basis of it having a toxic reputation. So if you are not tackling toxicity within your video game and your video game community, what you are doing is you are essentially starving yourself of the oxygen of your player base, you are starving yourself of the oxygen of your next generation of players, and ultimately you're putting yourself in a not great position. And the reason why that position really isn't great is because of the induced cost. So over the last half decade, one of the really big trends in terms of regulation has been the implementation of online safety laws across the world. A number of them are sort of still in the process of being implemented. They're still in the process of being put into place. But across the world, the general thrust of the laws work in the following way. They believe that user-to-user communication platforms, which include video games, which have user-to-user functionality, or video games platforms like Discord, where you can make those kinds of comms, they are rolled into the wider concerns around companies not doing enough to tackle harmful, hateful content online. So therefore, companies have been handed with a duty of care to take much more responsibility for looking after their audiences, for tackling illegal content and harm, and if they don't do it, be subject to potentially hefty fines and hefty punishments. And what you're seeing is that this is consistently rolling out across the world. So in terms of Australia, you're talking about $500,000 of basically financial penalty every day that you are considered to be non-compliant with certain elements of online safety rules if you are found guilty of it. I think at the moment X is currently having that particular back and forth with the government. In the European Union, under the Digital Services Act, which came into force earlier this year in February, you can suffer fines of up to 6% of your global turnover under the terms of the Act if you are not taking down things like hateful content in the right framework. In the UK, it can be 10% of your turnover or £18 million, so somewhere in the region of about 35, 36 million Aussie dollars if you are found to be breaking the rules. And the United States, at the moment, it's not been passed, and there is some question about what will happen in terms of the election in regards to the Kids Online Safety Act. But if Harris wins, it's probably pretty likely that a Kids Online Safety Act will pass, and it will also probably impose likely financial penalties upon people. And I think the really important thing here to go is lots of people go, well, hang on, surely this is just for big tech, right? You know, this is just a stick to scare Meta and those kinds of people. And it is. But the other thing that regulators are always looking for are for people who blatantly break rules. So regulators have to adopt what I kind of call a dipstick approach. They can't look at everything that's going on because you have obviously so many games, so many platforms on the market. So instead, they go after companies who clearly break the rules. So this is from Ofcom, this is the UK's Communications Authority. They've actually not released their Online Safety Act guidance just yet because it's in the final processes of becoming law. But I pulled this from a note that they put out in regards to competition law, which aligns exactly with what the Ofcom team have told me behind closed doors in regards to how the Online Safety Act will be enforced for platforms and for video games companies. So again, this was around a specific thing around competition law, but for example, whether the allegation concerns conduct that is or that appears to be a repeated, intentional, or particularly flagrant contravention or infringement, whether the business which is under investigation has a history of similar contraventions or infringements, or a demonstrated record of poor compliance. So if you are obviously breaking the rules, and you are easily spotted breaking the rules, then that means that you are more likely to come under action from a regulator. And what are video games other than very high-profile targets? We're well aware of the long-term reputation of the video game sector that often makes it quite attractive for action from people who believe that video games may cause harms within society. And we're also well aware that video games communities can be very noisy. So that means that they become a very obvious target for action if there is an issue consistently raised. So as well as costing yourself money directly because players don't want to spend, costing you money because players don't want to play your game, you can actually end up costing yourself severe cash by getting fined by a regulator, by allowing toxicity to flourish. So that's the business case. Now into the moral case. And this is where the things do start getting a little bit more difficult, but we'll start with the more positive side. So I think the real reason why we want to make video games communities kinder and we want to try and eradicate toxicity is because video games communities are great. Like they are, as mentioned earlier, fantastic, fun places where we can see all kinds of amazing things happen within them. And, you know, this is stuff that's happened over the last decade. We've seen things like the amount of money raised for charity by video games communities and video games fans have been extraordinary. You know, at the start of the Ukraine conflict, it was essentially Epic Games was able to raise $144 million for victims of the crisis through the Red Cross in less than 10 days. That is an enormous testament to the positive power of video games to go and do good within the world directly. Throughout the COVID crisis, you had the World Health Organization working with games developers to reach hundreds of millions of players around the world with messages around social distancing, with messages about encouraging people to go and get vaccinated. So again, a real positive net good. You have a game called Sea Hero Quest, which I don't know how many of you will have ever heard of because it came out 9 years ago. But essentially, the game was a very simple game in which you get a boat and you navigate through an ocean. You're given a map at the start of the game and you go from buoy to buoy and you get a star rating based on, you know, how many of those buoys you could get to within a certain period of time. On the face of it, it's a fun little mobile game. Asks a few questions about who you are, where you're from, in between various rounds, whatever. But underneath that, they designed it in partnership with academic researchers who wanted to understand how people's spatial reasoning changes over time and across the world. Because if you get people to conduct certain tests that essentially look at their spatial reasoning, like can they draw a line clearly from dot to certain places, you can start understanding things like cognitive decline and, for example, the impact of Alzheimer's on someone. But what they needed was an enormous data set to do this. So Sea Hero Quest launched. got to the top of the app stores, 4.3 million people played it, and as a result of this game being created, they generated the equivalent of what would have taken academics 117 years to generate in terms of data around spatial reasoning. And as a result of that, there is now an open source database that essentially looks and explores at how your spatial reasoning changes over time, depending upon your geography, your age, your location, which has been cited in 26 different academic papers looking at the impact of things like Alzheimer's upon your reasoning and what you can learn from that. Massive impact, enormous impact, and something that was achieved because they tapped into the concerns of millions of people around the world who had seen a member of family, say, go through Alzheimer's or go through dementia and go, I want to help. And then obviously environmental. I mentioned the Playing for the Planet Alliance earlier. Alborough Wildlife Adventure by us too, when that came out, they made very simple commitments that every time we sell a game, we're going to plant a tree. So that figure is now well over 1 million. But if you look more recently, the Playing for the Planet Alliance is doing a campaign at the moment in which 50 video games companies across the world have set themselves the goal of inspiring 1 million positive actions towards climate change over the course of the month of October. So we're going to see in the course of the next month whether video games can lead to meaningful change within society. And so look, we see all of these positive things, right? We know all of these things are happening. And I think as everyone in this room who's a passionate advocate for the power of video games, we want to talk about this stuff and we want to be able to do this. But the problem is that toxicity continually drains essentially all of the energy out of the room. And in particular, it does it in regards to one thing, which is Gamergate. So if you want the best example of how unkind game communities make not just our world worse, but the entire world worse, you can't pick anything more than Gamergate. So Dr. Julia Rebner, so she is Oxford University's Professor of Extremism, Extremism Head. But she was also author of Going Dark, a book about going into online communities to understand what was going on within extreme spaces and what was happening within there. And I interviewed her for some of the research for my book to go and talk about online communities and their links to extremist movements. And what she said was that Gamergate created the playbook that extremists and the far right still use today. The Gamergate campaign back in 2014, what it basically established was that you can have a leaderless hate group that can have specific targeted actions against people that can successfully lead to change, like, for example, companies pulling advertising spend from website, securing media coverage, that, as a result of that, inspired loads and loads of other movements, which included QAnon. So James Ball, the author of QAnon, goodness me, I've just completely forgotten that subtitle, but James Ball wrote a brilliant book about QAnon in which he says specifically that when you look at the tactics and approach of QAnon, it was both inspired by people who'd been working within the Gamergate movement, driven forwards by people within the Gamergate movement, and that a similar thing also happened with Alternative Right, aka the alt-right, when it was founded in 2015. They specifically looked at and referenced Gamergate as their target for what we can achieve in terms of pushing forwards far-right values and extremist values, especially within contexts like America. And I think the thing that was really problematic about it is that that created a community that then essentially intersected with all kinds of other theories in terms of displacement theories, in terms of theories that sought to essentially demonize people from different religions, that sought to demonize women. And that was part of, unfortunately, what went into inspiring the perpetrator of the Christchurch mass shooting. If you go and look at Brenton Tarrant's manifesto, which he launched at the same time as he launched the attack, it is littered with coded video games references. It is littered with references back to movements that are very similar to Gamergate, and specifically things like as well the Chan movements too. And that when you ultimately look even unfortunately at the tape of the recording in which he went and committed this atrocity, as you can see in a first-person shooter style, which was streamed live on Facebook, he opens up with a comment, "Subscribe to PewDiePie," because he knows that his audience is going to be aware that that is a coded reference to them all being gamers, them all being part of the same community. And unfortunately, since this attack, Tarrant has basically been identified as a hero by people who've gone and engaged in similar attacks across the world, including an attack in Germany, in Halle, in which someone was shot dead outside a synagogue, and in 2022 in Buffalo, New York, in which 9 people were shot dead in a supermarket in New York by someone who was radicalized initially through Roblox, and then ended up in extreme communities aligned to this. So this is having profound, terrible impacts, and it's also undermining our democracy. So, as one final point around this, these audiences that have been inspired by these extreme hateful narratives, they're now being deliberately targeted by state actors for the purposes of destabilising democracy. So this was literally from last month, and it was documents basically unsealed by the Department of Justice that was essentially revealed as they were beginning action against a Russian agent who was trying to run a misinformation campaign in the UK called the Good Old USA Project. And as you can see here, the document describes this category of gamers and chat room users as the backbone of the right-wing trends in the US segment of the internet. They were explicitly taking advantage of the fact that these communities have been left to fester and making them a potential avenue through which you can destabilise and attack a democracy. So we have now led to this point where ultimately problematic game communities, they've become a battleground. And I saw this 2 weeks ago. So I was in New York for the UN General Assembly meeting, and maybe it's sort of heartening to see this, but the State Department in the US, their Global Engagement Center, which tackles misinformation and disinformation, now has a video game strategy and is now working with nation states across the world to try and find ways to push back against problematic game communities and give them information that helps them to push back against both misinformation, disinformation, and hateful content within those spaces. But the quote from James B. Rubin, who's a former Clinton administration official who now heads up the GCAP, he said, "We are focused on meeting people where they are. It's clear that whether it is through games themselves or through platforms like Discord, that is where they are." So our communities have become those spaces, and it means that we have much more moral responsibility than ever to go and keep them safe. So all of those costs of toxicity, the damage to the people who play games across the world, the people who we are seeking to entertain and inform and enjoy video games, we are hurting them by allowing toxicity to exist. There's the harm to our businesses and the industry we love. Ultimately, in the end, toxicity costs us money, it makes our jobs harder, it makes the world a harder place. And that's particularly true because it helps foster the growth of extremism, terror, and political upheaval. Because video games communities are not isolated. They are the forefront of the digital landscape, and the digital landscape is the forefront of the modern world. So therefore, what happens in games and what happens within games communities affects everyone. So, some thoughts on creating kinder communities. How do we go about dealing with this? The answer on it is honestly not easy. There's no one-size-fits-all approach to this, and I think it's unfair as well to try and suggest that we should be perhaps burdening everyone with the same level of expectation. I think it is more than reasonable to say that an independent developer who is working on a small video game that's going to have maybe a small Discord community around it has a different burden of responsibility to a major platform that reaches millions and billions of people. But at the same time, I think there's still a way for us all to think about it and think about the challenge that I think is best summarised by Galen Lamphere England, who's the co-founder of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, which is a global organisation that essentially brings together experts from academia, experts from law enforcement, and the video games industry to create and produce research around this point. And what he says is that digital gaming platforms akin to public community areas play a crucial role in shaping social interactions and fostering community connections. And in that particular point around public community areas, in a report called Control or Collaborate that came out in February earlier this year, Galen and his co-author, a guy called Menzo Hartgers, compared video games to the sports stadiums of the modern age. They are places where people come and congregate to have fun, to be entertained, and the vast majority of people in those spaces are there to have a good time. But what happens in those spaces is that you do have individuals, you do have groups who seek to exploit them, to take advantage of them, to tap someone on the shoulder and go, "I saw you were a bit lonely there, my friend. Do you want to come and meet our friends here?" Take them to a nearby pub, a nearby bar. Funnily enough, it's a group of extremists who are saying, "Come on in, be friends with us. Oh, but now you're friends with us, we need you to do a loyalty test. Can you throw a brick through a window to show what's going on?" That pathway, that funnel, that is exactly how digital extremism works as well. People start at places like an online open video games chat, and this is one of the things around why you want to stop misogynistic content in particular. They will do something like make a misogynistic joke over the voice chat, note down the identities of the people who laughed at it, send a separate request to them saying, "I noticed you laughed and no one else did. Do you want to join a like-minded group of people who get our sense of humour?" And they take them into Discord, they take them into Telegram channels, where they take them down the pathway to extremist radicalisation. And the reason why I bring up that particular thing is actually because sports went through quite a similar problem in the UK in terms to what I'm talking about in terms of extremism in video games. So into the 1970s and the 1980s in terms of the sport of football, hooliganism, especially by people who are sort of close and adjacent to the far right, was one of the major challenges that afflicted British football. And what it led to was a number of stadium disasters in which either rioting fans or the perception of football fans being rioters led to multiple deaths in places like Heysel in Belgium, in places like Hillsborough, which you may have heard of, the Hillsborough disaster. And as a result of that, there was a concerted effort by everyone involved in the world of sport around football to go, well, hang on a second, we don't want this. Why should people be going to football matches and dying as a result of the reputation of hooligans leading to the complete toxic pollution of the space? And so what happened was there were a series of laws put in place to try and make stadiums safer, to try and make them more inclusive. The financial settlement of football changed. It's what led to the invention of the Premier League. And a big reason why that was created was to essentially fund football teams to help make improvements to their stadiums to keep people safe. But as they started to do that, and they made their communities safer and safer, what they started to realise, a bit like my football club, Luton Town, who had this problem with extremists, despite the fact that the stadium was based within one of the boroughs in the country that has the highest percentage Muslim population in the entire country, was actually if you start bringing people into those spaces and you start creating kinder spaces by working with everyone within the community to create an inclusive atmosphere around it, not only do your places become safer, they also become more profitable because people feel more secure coming to those spaces, wider audiences feel like they can come and take part, and you have these kinds of moments where you have this sort of cross-pollination of cultures. And so this was something that happened at Luton a couple of years ago, in which representatives from the Bury Park Mosque, which is just around the corner from the stadium, who traditionally would never have been coming to matches, came out, and it was just during the run-up to Christmas. They essentially just started to hand out chocolates and leaflets about the work they do in their community, just to explain to the fans who may not have previously interacted with them about what they do. So by fostering a kinder community space within the world of sport, we have seen an end to a lot of those horrible disasters. We have seen the sport itself grow. We've seen the audience for the sport grow as well. I think one of the big reasons why women's football is so big in the UK now is because of so many of these developments leading down the line to a world where people said, well, hang on, why don't we continue catering to that audience? So what that means in terms of practicalities, though, that was an example. I'm going to try and give you some sort of nuts and bolts to think about. So I think there are like 3 pillars that support the creation of kinder communities and one thing that goes underneath. And I think the pillars are essentially rules, tools, and culture. So you have your rules around the way that people choose to interact around your community space. So you have your terms of service for the game and what you say is acceptable and what's okay. It's not enough. It's legally enough, but it's not enough culturally. You also need to have things like codes of conduct for communities, meaningful sanctions for misbehaviour, to make it clear what's going to happen if you behave well and what's going to happen if you don't. To support, essentially, the functioning of those rules, though, you need tools. The tool sets are improving, and we'll show you some examples in a moment, but you need things like content moderation services, including AI tools and things like voice moderation tools, which we'll come to in a moment. You want to have things like social media and media monitoring tools, so you can start assessing what people are saying about your game online, because that's actually quite a useful way for you potentially identifying people who are toxic within your community, and also making sure that tools are available to users too. Making sure that they have things like the ability to report, the ability to block, the ability to mute, and that they are easy to use and easily understood. It's really important. But I think one of the really key points is actually cultural. You need to make sure that there is this top-down support for these standards. You don't want to be putting in place rules and tools and not have your leadership aspire to it as well. The whole company and everyone who's involved within the game, including the community, has to be brought along with this, and it has to be said that this is a key priority for everybody. Because if you take a good public stance on your rules, your values, your standards, you consistently apply those values and rules, then it becomes much easier to keep your communities safer, to keep them kinder. And I think underneath all of that, you have just that ongoing work. So you want to be making sure you're informing users of values, training staff, implementing evolving tools to make sure you're working, and also creating partnerships with relevant organisations who might be able to help. But what this looks like in practice, big tech actually has done a lot of the better work on this so far because they are the most vulnerable to a lot of the online safety rules. But some good examples, first of all, of rules. So this is Microsoft's enforcement stacking user journey graph that they released earlier this year. They actually did a big press push around this. And what they were doing was essentially illustrating all of the new rules and processes in place that essentially will happen if someone does something that is, for example, hate speech, harassment or bullying within a game. And what you can see here is a very clear communication of what happens in terms of when a report is raised, what that means in terms of a strike system, what that means in terms of banning people, what it means even in terms of rehabilitation. Now, they have publicly communicated this and they've put this out for the world, and what they have done is not go and say we're going to hide this behind closed doors, we're going to say it exists and only show it to people when asked. They've said this is actually how we're doing it. And so that gives you both a sense of what they're doing to protect people, but also gives you a sense of how you can design your approach to protecting people and making sure those standards are in place. So I think that's a really important thing to be thinking about. In terms of those tools, I was actually speaking to someone earlier about this, about there's a company called Modulate, which does AI voice moderation to essentially help reduce toxicity within voice chat. And their most recent report in July 2024, which VentureBeat covered, they've implemented within Call of Duty, and they found that basically toxicity exposure was reduced 50% in voice chat after this was introduced, and that as a result of ToxMod being brought into Modern Warfare 3, there was an 8% reduction in repeat offenders month over month and a 25% reduction in exposure to toxicity. You know, it's very difficult to tackle these challenges alone because, frankly, you've just got so many people to go and deal with and address. But there are now increasingly tools that are coming into place that can help you automate those challenges. And then finally, a company that I will admit is much maligned, Roblox. Roblox has a real challenge because they have a team of a few thousand people and they have a day-to-day user population of 79.5 million, which means that Roblox is bigger in population terms than the country of Thailand. So there is a lot that Roblox could probably be doing better, but one of the things that they do genuinely lead on is their culture around what they're trying to do in terms of their online safety, and in particular this concept of digital civility, which their team has been working on for the past few years and are continuing to work on. And the idea is that they are now working with schools, with users, and with other people to introduce the idea that you're not just a user of Roblox, you're a digital citizen, and therefore you have certain rights on how you can express yourself, but you now have certain responsibilities too. And they have been working with online safety experts in Boston, in London, and across the world to draw up these guidelines. And the person who is actually leading the creation of them is someone who's got a 20-year history of online safety expertise in the UK at the forefront of what's going on in terms of the safety space. So they've been building that kind of culture within Roblox. But there's two final things before I'm going to wrap up. I'm looking at people across this room and going, yes, these are companies that have billions and billions of dollars. What on earth can we do, right? And so what I'm doing instead is just summarizing by saying, so much of this is like no cost in terms of how you start. Like you're not necessarily going to be at a point where you're going to have to deal with all of these challenges because you're not going to have the scale, you're not going to have to worry. But I think in the same way that you think about how can you prepare your games business for growth, how can you prepare it to scale, you want to think about how you can scale kindness from the outset. So the first thing is like put it at the heart of your work. You know, define your company's values and make sure that creating kind communities, a lot like any of you who are in the talk this morning from Clara in terms of hipster whale, kindness is not the same as niceness, but it is that kind of really useful foundation. But you need to make sure it's in all of your values from the outset because you need to get the whole team behind it. Because too often it's left to the community managers who are left on the front line to deal with this stuff. But actually you need the technology support and infrastructure to help them get there. And I think the other thing as well, seek advice from civil society, NGOs, charities and regulators, constantly looking for ways to help the video games industry to solve these challenges. Because for them, actually doing the process of law enforcement and going in and investigating someone, it's expensive, it is timely, it is costly, it is much cheaper for them to work with businesses and prevent things rather than have to deal with them. So these kinds of organisations, they're often very ready to help and are ready to help you when asked, but you need to go and do that, which can be difficult to do. And I've got some advice on that as well, which I'll be happy to share afterwards. And then just that final thing, just to really hammer this down, that 4-step approach to creating the foundation for kindness as cheaply as possible within the foundation of what you can do. So on that point about values, write them down. Don't just say that you subscribe to them, put them into documents, make sure that people are on board with the company read them, make sure that everyone who's designing things for you reads them, make sure that every single thing possible talks about it, because there's no excuse for anyone not being involved in the creation of it once that's there. Next thing is then translating those values that you have into clear rules. You want to build repeatable, robust processes to make protecting your community simple. No questions of interpretation. These are the rules. If this thing happens, this thing happens. If you're unsure about how to do that, my advice, go and speak to a lawyer, because a lawyer is actually going to be very helpful for you to go and design these kinds of things. But also go and speak to people potentially at bigger businesses too who might have advice on this. The next thing is then communicate. Tell people about it. Make it really clear everywhere you can. In-game messaging. If you've got community channels, make sure they're pinned to the top. Make sure that there are very clear rule sets. If anyone signs up to join anything, they see the rules, or they have to access the rules or see something to basically get them on board. Because once you've done that, it makes it so much easier to enforce. And then live your values and enforce the rules. So instead of me putting like a truncheon here to be like, enforce the rules, yes, you need to do that. If someone breaks the rules, you're going to have to go and block them. You're going to have to ban them. You're going to have to take the necessary action. But, I picked out here a British charity called Special Effect, the positive side of the values. Go and do the things like support charitable causes. Go and support good causes within your game. Essentially live the values that you aspire to in terms of building a better world. Because if you do that, there are going to be some people who kick back, but you don't really want to be going back towards those people. So anyway, I'm at time. And so to conclude, toxic communities damage games, our businesses and society. Addressing the issue in regard to toxic communities is a matter of significance for us all. There's a lot we can do, but I think we can also go a lot further too. I think we've only literally sort of started to scratch the surface of this, and I don't think I've got all of the answers. I think we have a lot more conversation to be had. But I hope, at least by going through this, that we've looked at some of the more challenging elements of toxic communities and hopefully really inspired people to take tangible action to tackle them. Thank you very much.